This is a Zach Feldman Show replay on ZRadioLive.com.
He has a new book out called Is America Broken or Has It Always Been That Way? It is Tony Aguilar. Tony, thanks so much for joining me here on the Zach Feldman Show. How's everything going?
Everything's going well, and thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, anytime. Tell me all about this brand new book. And, obviously we're going to answer the question, is America broken?
Well, I started the book back in 2024, and the reason I wrote the book was because of a New York Times article I read. This is way before President Biden had dropped out of the race.
Yeah.
And the New York Times article was called, "Why is Joe Biden Struggling? Because America is Broken." And I had a kind of a different take on that, because I think once we start saying that the nation is broken or whatever we want to say, we remove the onus from the electorate who have made deliberate decisions as to the direction of the country. And I also wanted to point out that a lot of the issues that the nation is facing, it has been facing for decades, if not centuries. So I wanted to put that there, but also wanted to create kind of a counter narrative to what we all hear at times, which is, this is not America, this is not who we are. Usually that will come after a significant incident of violence, anti-Semitism, racist, or whatever the case may be. And that is not all of who we are, but it is part of the American DNA that I do think we need to wrestle with to come up with solutions.
Yeah, I mean, it's important because, obviously it's so hard. And especially we've seen that with the Charlie Kirk assassination, that literally it's hard to put your opinion out there and not have other people retaliate in a violent manner or in just like in an unconstitutional way, just literally it's I guess like it's kind of hard for all of us to even push our own opinions out there. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why maybe America's broken in your sense. But I'd love to hear more from you. What are the things that you're noticing on your end that are broken?
Well, just to take for example, when you just talked about violence and retribution and all of that, and if we go back to the '60s were a very violent time. We lost President Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and there was a lot of violence going on. And so I'm not sure if there's more today. I know people are afraid of violence today, but violence in terms of a political act has been in this country for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Even if you go back to, you go back to history, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. I mean, we forget that.
100%.
One of the most famous plays in the country right now is about that.
Let's not forget about Abraham Lincoln. Hello.
Lincoln.
Literally just sitting down and watching a play.
Exactly. So, political violence is not new in the country. I think it's more noticed now because of the widespread aspect of social media and the like. But it's not really a new phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I think though too. I mean, a lot of the American people. I don't want to speak for everybody. Obviously, everybody has their own opinions. But a lot of people see these protests also out there. No matter what they're about, where it comes to either against Israel versus Gaza, or it's about Trump and No Kings protests, things like that. They see all this happening, and I think a lot of people are either scared about pushing their own ideology, or they're scared about just what's going to happen out there if they're in the world and just mind their own business.
Exactly. And I think that is something we need to wrestle with, because the idea of someone being assassinated because of their political views, no matter how onerous they may be, is something we need to wrestle with. And that's going to take a lot of effort on behalf of the American people, as well as the American political leadership, who some have used it to their benefit to give them greater exposure to their base or whatever. But I think that needs to be something that we truly wrestle with, because we do want we do want a lot of different opinions in the public square, because that I think that is the beauty of America,
Yeah.
that we have different viewpoints. And when people become afraid of doing that, we're not the America we claim to be. And so we need to really wrestle with that. Now, how we do that is difficult. Robert F. Kennedy Sr. had said, progress is nice, change is its catalyst, but change has its enemies. So we have to wrestle with this in the best way that we can.
Yeah, 100%, and I completely agree with that too. I mean, we only get better when we listen to everybody's opinion, and
Exactly.
get both sides of the party. That's why for me, I'm an independent because I love to hear both sides of everything and then make my own judgment. I mean, literally, that's how America should be. But we've kind of fell back on that stance. And something about your book too, you also mentioned about about the regular American system too. You're talking about that it's not just a broken system; it's a rigged one. Tell me about how it's a rigged one.
I think if you look at, for example, during the COVID crisis, COVID pandemic, there was $4 trillion of wealth created, and a large percentage of that went obviously towards the upper income classes. When you go back to the Gilded Age, you see this wealth disparity that was tremendous, and it has only gotten worse. And I think people are wondering how in the world can so much wealth be created and it's not funneling down, which is what, Ronald Reagan ran on in terms of trickle down economics. And people really don't see that. And so when you begin to think, even with the last shutdown that we just had, people's healthcare premiums are going to go up.
Mhm.
It's what they're projecting. And people are saying things are working against them as opposed to for them. And you see, for example, multi-trillion-dollar tax cut, the majority of which goes to the upper 1%, and people are struggling.
Yeah.
And so people are saying that this system, while it is one of the best systems in the world, does not seem to be working for them. And I think that was part of the message that was sent in the elections a couple of weeks ago, that we need a system that is going to work for them. Now, how you get there, that's a different question.
Mhm.
And that I think is going to take a lot of debate, a lot of arguing, but it has to be worked out somewhere in the political realm, peacefully, of course, so that people can feel that the system is working for them. For example, you've had now the idea that we're going to bail out Argentina, but we're not bailing out the farmers. And so people are beginning to wonder, who is this system really for? And I think that's a legitimate question that needs to be debated.
Yeah, 100%. I think that definitely needs to be debated. I want to ask you too. You mentioned a lot about in the book. You mentioned a lot about about the government itself too. Playing a big role in the process too. Tell me about that.
Well, if you go back, particularly in the civil rights movement, well, if we go back even further, let's say we go back to the New Deal.
Mhm.
The New Deal, quite frankly, is one of the first times when the worker was placed at the center of politics
Well,
in
for those who
terms
don't
of
know, what is the New Deal?
the New Deal is what was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the midst of the Great Depression, and which essentially created a lot of different programs, created housing programs, created construction programs, in essence, to put people back to work. So the government can have a big effect. Now, let's be honest, not everybody was in favor of the New Deal.
Hmm.
But I think the average working person was. It put them back to work. We had upwards of 30% unemployment at the time. So a lot of those projects, a lot of your high schools that were built as a result of the New Deal. If you go to Texas and you see a lot of the Riverwalk, that's a part of the New Deal. So I think people saw this working on their behalf. But you also had, as part of that, the New Deal also got rid of child labor laws in terms of when I say got rid of them, where children could work. Roosevelt got rid of that. So it began to put the worker, not perfectly, of course, but it began to put the worker at the middle of what I would call a recovery of America. And I think that is a good thing. The other thing it did, however, is that when it came to, let's say, race, well, there's a lot of evidence that there were segregationist aspects to it. For example, the home loan department
Yeah.
refused to guarantee loans to African Americans if they moved into white neighborhoods. So you
Insane.
also had that. So, but I think on the whole, the New Deal was a good thing for American workers,
Mhm.
and in the sense that it allowed them to have a voice in the workplace and the like. So I think in general it was good. It was transformational in terms of the workforce.
Also, you mentioned in the book too. It's really important to go out there and vote. Do you feel like history kind of repeats itself, and do you think it's repeating itself here in 2025?
Oh, absolutely. I think if you look at, for example, now, well, we have the National Guard in a number of cities, or in a couple of cities. We have immigration and deportation. Well, that has occurred before. Occurred under Hoover.
Hmm.
So we've had this before. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that has occurred. So this is nothing new. We also had the internment of Japanese Americans, in which Ronald Reagan finally made sure that they receive compensation for that time.
Hmm.
So this is a lot of this is not new. It seems new, and it could be that it's a lot more extreme, but the idea of it is not new. But in terms of voting, um, I like to remind people that if you go back to 2016, and a lot of people did not vote in 2016, a lot of people did not vote in 2024. Well, in 2016, people did not vote. They said they couldn't vote for this person or that person, but either way, you had a president who is now able to appoint three justices to the Supreme Court:
Hmm.
Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh. And as a result, they overturned Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
So, and then you have a situation in which you have now, you have this situation where Brett Kavanaugh writes an opinion that actually suggests that profiling is okay.
Hmm.
And then you have the same Supreme Court who is now looking at the civil rights movement, particularly the Civil Rights Bill of 1965, where Section 2 is going to be obliterated. And this is something that John Roberts has been looking to do since he was working with the Reagan administration. So the idea of voting, a lot of people say voting doesn't matter. Well, it does matter. And you can see it in terms of a woman's right to choose being taken away, the Civil Rights Bill or the Civil Rights Act being obliterated.
Hmm.
Also, in terms of now, you have a case of profiling, which is taking place all around the country right now. So I think the vote is the ultimate way that we have to either show our displeasure or to right the nation according to how our own particular ideology.
Yeah. 100%. I completely agree with that. It's so sad that that obviously voting leads to different consequences.
Mhm.
Especially like that. But that's our democracy. And
Exactly.
that's what we strive to keep in the United States. Is democracy, and keep that right to vote. It's so important. Why do you think a lot of people though nowadays they kind of take that for granted?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that it is such, people say, my individual vote cannot matter. And so I can understand that premise, how one person can make a difference. But I do tell people, so, President Trump won the last election with less than 50% of the vote. And so he won it by about a percentage point, and
Mm.
that made a huge difference. Whether you agree or disagree, it signified a change of direction for the country.
You know what's crazy though is that I live in New York, and New York has never ever switched sides or ever gone other sides other than whatever New York City decides on,
Hmm.
which is obviously it makes sense. Obviously, New York City is the densest, most populated area in all of New York. It's in itself, but there are so if you look at that map from this year, you could see how vastly different the opinions were on that entire state. Do you think that itself is an issue, or do you think that's that's part of our democracy?
That's part of our democracy.
Yeah.
And I think, one thing I do want to remind folk, it's not that, conservative versus liberal versus libertarianism
Mhm.
or the like. There's room for all of these ideologies. The question is, how far do you take them? So, and I think people need to maybe take a step back and probably examine the other person's viewpoint, not to the degree that it would make you a child of a lesser God,
Mhm.
so to speak, but to say, you may have a point. In history, Shirley Chisholm, when she ran for president,
Mhm.
George Wallace, who was a staunch segregationist, was shot.
Yeah.
And Shirley Chisholm, Congresswoman, went down to the hospital in Alabama to visit him. And she sat with him and met with him and talked with him. Now, he was a staunch segregationist, and yet she felt it necessary to go engage him in conversation. That did not change, that didn't put him on the road to Emmaus immediately, but several years later, he did change. And so I think that's an example of someone who says, listen, if we open up for conversation, maybe some things can happen. Maybe some things can change. And I think that is a good sign. That's a good example for all of us in who want to be political. But I think the nation itself needs to wrestle with the fact that 40% of its electorate doesn't show up consistently.
Yeah. 100%.
And in the when you go to the midterm elections, it's less than 60%. It's about 50%. Now we will see what happens in 2026. But if history is any indicator, uh, that might be low as well. And I think we need to wrestle with that. And I think we need to understand that we have a civic duty. We are not subjects of a kingdom waiting for decisions from on high. We are citizens who are responsible for the direction of the country. That's why we're a representative democracy.
That's awesome. Well, Tony, I got to ask you too. What got you so passionate about politics and about American history?
Well, I've been in politics to a degree. I was, a community organizer for about 10 years.
Yeah.
And so
You have
with
over
that,
30 years of public experience too.
oh,
As a
exactly.
speaker and writer, workshop leader too. But
Oh,
what got you into politics specifically?
well, specifically, I was working with the bank, and then, my pastor came to me and said, they're building this organization, and because they had done this organization in Brooklyn
Yeah.
called East Brooklyn Congregations, and they were going to do the same thing in the South Bronx.
Hmm.
And so he got me interested in that. And one thing led to another, and which led to because my view of politics is not necessarily being elected to office. And I struggle with that, but I didn't want to be elected. But we were able to do a lot of stuff in terms of affordable housing. I went on to do economic development with the Queens organization and did, living wage when I went to the Jersey City organization.
Hmm.
So politics to me is not necessarily running for office. It's about being engaged in the political system. Either you could be elected, but sometimes it's being an organizer, sometimes it's being a leader of organization. So it can take on many purviews, so to
Yeah.
speak, in terms of what you do when it comes to politics.
That's incredible. That really is really, really cool. And it's cool that you've kind of took your passion then and brought that into this book too. Is America broken, or has it always been that way? It's on Amazon, by the way. Let me ask you too. You're a big jazz guy. You love jazz music. What do you suggest, or what do you think is kind of the song of 2025 in terms of jazz?
Well, in terms of 2025, I couldn't tell you what's the song in 2025. I can tell you that,
What does it feel like, I should say?
well, what it feels like, jazz is no longer what it was. Okay.
Yeah.
I remember the days of Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, and I saw them in person. Count Basie, Lionel Hampton, all of these people that I got to see.
Yeah.
And what I see now, you do have some folk, Wynton Marsalis, who I think is one of the great organizers
Hmm.
of jazz. He with the Philharmonic.
Yeah, he's incredible.
So he's incredible. And I think the only one, for example, New York is the only city right now, major city, that does not have a jazz festival,
Yeah, which is insane.
which is insane.
Mhm.
And I think Mr. Marsalis, I think, is probably the only one who could put that together because of who he is and his family lineage and the like. So, if Winton is listening, we'd love to see organize something like that. But Christian McBride also, I think, is another person who could possibly put something like that together.
Yeah.
And I think a collaboration between someone like Mr. McBride and Winter Marsalis could do wonders in the field of jazz.
Yeah.
And those are just two incredible musicians right now.
I want to
But
ask you too, just to wrap up everything.
sure.
Now, obviously we're going into 2026 now. What about it is pivotal? Well, what about it is going to be important?
In terms of politics,
Yeah, in terms of everything. In terms of like what we're going into in
I think
2026.
2026, I have to say, I think will be a transition point for the nation. That if the nation does not change its direction in 2026, or if 2026 is somehow marred by controversy, then I think the nation will be in a very, very bad place.
Hmm.
So I think it is important for people to be out there to do your organizing, whichever side of the fence you're on, but to be engaged by 2026. Because I think 2026 and 2028 are pivotal points in American history. We think that we're immune to what has happened to other nations. So, we look at Viktor Orban and say that can never happen here. Well, I beg to differ. We think that, what Erdogan is doing in Turkey cannot happen here. I beg to differ with that. So I think 2026 is going to be pivotal in the history of American democracy. It's our 250th anniversary, but I think we need to be prepared to say we need to, if we believe that the nation is broken, we need to be prepared to right the ship. Otherwise, I think 2028 might be a hard rock to climb.
Mm.
And so I think 2026 is going to be pivotal.
All right. Well, Tony Aguilar, seriously, thank you so much for joining me here on the Zach Feldman Show. You can check out the book. Again, it's called Is America Broken or Has It Always Been That Way? It's on Amazon. But for Tony, for those who want to find you online, where can they go?
They can go to my website, which is cmcgmedia.com. They can also go to my other page, which is Aguilar Commentary, which I do a weekly commentary, which is aguilarcommentary.com, as well as my podcast, which will be restarting in December,
Oh, awesome.
which is the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective. And that'll be starting again in December.
Very cool. Well, hopefully we can get that on Z Radio Live. That'd be awesome.
Absolutely.
Very cool. Tony Aguilar, thank you so much for joining me here on the Zach Feldman Show. And best of luck with everything and best of luck with this brand new book.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it.
Anytime. The Website Music Station, Z Radio Live, back with more Zach Feldman Show right after this.
Want to hear more? Listen to the Zach Feldman Show every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on ZRadioLive.com.